Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Capitol Lakes. My name is Tim Conroy. I'm the executive director here, and I have the privilege of welcoming you to Poverty, Housing, and Evictions in Dane County and Madison, an event that our amazing residents have planned and arranged all on their own through their amazing connections, as we've had a great discussion of Go Big Read and many people reading it here. I just ask you to silence your cell phones, and we're going to save questions to the end. And let me introduce our panelists tonight, who are all described in your brochure. Linda Ketchum, David Long, Steve Steinhoff, and Ian Ailey. Welcome, and let's begin.
Good evening. Is it on? Yes. Okay. I try not to mumble. My mom used to tell me I mumbled, so please raise your hand if I reach a point where you cannot hear me. My name is Linda Ketchum. I am the Executive Director of Madison Area Urban Ministry, and I do want to thank the organizers for this evening's event and for inviting me to be part of it. For those of you who might not know much about Madison Area Urban Ministry, also known as MUM, we are a private, interfaith 501c3 social justice organization. Over our 43-year history, we have developed and spun off over 25 nonprofits in Dane County, including 4 of the Madison Senior Coalition's Project Home, and we were the organization that founded Transitional Housing, which was the group while under our umbrella opened the men's shelter at Porchlight. Or at Grace Episcopal Church. That organization merged in 2004 to become Porchlight. So we have a history in these housing issues. We also work with people who are returning to the community from prison. 80% of the men and women who walk through our doors are homeless after incarceration. If you've read Evicted, and I'm going to guess because I know you all look incredibly bright and committed, I'm guessing most of you have read it. I will admit that I was finishing the epilogue between innings last night as a lifelong Cubs fan. But I did have the opportunity also to hear Matthew Desmond on Tuesday evening, and that was wonderful. In 2012, our organization was also asked by the Dane County Board to form a task force to study where the people who were living at the Occupy Madison site on East Washington Street might be able to go. And we said, we will do this, but we're not going to just look at where we can shuffle people who are homeless around in our city. We want to understand, as Desmond puts it, some of those underlying causes, because really homelessness and eviction are symptoms, right? When we offer shelter, homeless shelters, that's charity. The justice part of that, and that's what our organization is also concerned about, the justice part of homelessness and eviction is permanent housing that's affordable. The justice part of it is recognizing housing as a human right. So we were asked to do this study. We asked people from who are living in Occupy to be part of the task force. We asked clergy. We asked advocates in the community. We interviewed police and the mayor's office, other homeless people, all of the providers who work with people who are homeless. And we came up with a report that we presented to the county board on July 12th in 2012. And among those recommendations were a permanent day center, which is now working its way, some decade, to be open in the downtown area, the old it's Commerce Building. So. But we also recognized that there was a need. If you can imagine this, if you're homeless and you are discharged from the hospital post-surgery, where do you go? Where does the woman who's had a mastectomy in need of chemotherapy go from 7:30 in the morning until 5 p.m. when the shelter opens up? So we recognized the people who were living in unhoused helped us recognize this huge gap and a need for medical recuperative care. And so our Healing House project is our effort to provide 24/7 medical respite for families who have a child or parent who's in need of recuperative care. So that's kind of where we're at looking at some of these housing issues. But my charge this evening is to provide an overview of some of the issues Matthew Desmond raises in Eviction. And it's really kind of hard to know where to start because he raises so many issues and so many challenges that face our community and our state. At MUM, we work daily with people who are experiencing homelessness and with people facing eviction. And as I read Evicted, I could read those stories, and I could see the faces of men and women who have walked through our doors. I could close my eyes and I could see the apartment with the hole in the wall and the carpet that was so ground and dirty that I wasn't sure if I was stepping on the subfloor or an actual carpet. I could hear their voices as they shared their stories. And so what I thought I would do tonight is to share some of their stories that highlight the themes put forth in Evicted. And I have changed some of the names just because I don't have everyone's permission to share all of these details. Writer Eli Komarov wrote, "Poverty is like punishment for a crime you didn't commit. Being laid off from your job is not a crime. Getting sick and not having paid sick leave at your job is not a crime. Having a loved one die and being unable to afford the cost of the funeral unless you give up some of your rent money is not a crime. Advocating for the health of your family is not a crime. Being born into poverty is not a crime. And yet we live in a time when poverty at the national, state, and even our local level is increasingly being criminalized." The Madison Metropolitan School District's Transitional Education Program, also known as TEP, works exclusively with children in the Madison schools who are homeless. As of November 1st, over 1,000 Madison school children had been identified so far this school year as being homeless. And that does not count their younger siblings who aren't school age yet. In June of 2014, Rhonda, the single mother of a 14-year-old daughter, found herself needing to resign from her job in a fast food restaurant because her chemotherapy for stage 4 colon cancer was just draining too much of her energy. So she quit her job, but it took a while for her benefits to kick in. So she fell a little behind in her rent. She and her 14-year-old daughter thought that they would head out of state where they had some family and see if they could find some more affordable housing options. They came back a week later to find that their landlord had illegally evicted them and put everything they owned, every piece of clothing, every piece of furniture, every photo album, every dish, on the curb. And what hadn't been taken in by neighbors had been taken away by the trash collectors. So it was an illegal eviction, but as Rhonda would tell you, I didn't have the energy and I didn't have the money to hire a lawyer. And so she did what she and her daughter could do. They began living in their car. At that time, she also stopped chemo because she said, I can't be a mother and I can't be looking for an apartment and going through chemotherapy. Finally, in December of 2014, with the help of the TEP social workers, Rhonda found an apartment for she and her daughter. And I got a phone call from one of the social workers who asked if we could help furnish the apartment because they had nothing. And so we were able, with our church network and with other wonderful volunteers, to fully furnish her apartment, including dishes and towels and all of those wonderful things. And I remember as people she didn't know were unloading things and just giving her gift cards because it was December 22nd and just saying, go get something for your grandson, go get something for your daughter. The tears just streaming down her face. So she found an apartment, and things were still rough. She was still sick. Because she had quit chemo, her health had deteriorated. She had started chemo up again, but sometimes chemo does other things to your body. I'm going to guess a lot of you know that. And so I stopped by to visit her in March of 2015, and I was really glad. I just stopped by to say hi, and I found her in her bed. I knocked on the door. She yelled to come in. I came in. She was in the midst of a heart attack. So I called the ambulance. They came. She did recuperate. But then in October of 2015, Rhonda lost all of her belongings again. She still had her apartment, but the apartment experienced an infestation of bed bugs. And rather than use the heat treatment, which would have allowed her and every other tenant in that building to preserve their belongings, the landlord insisted on a chemical treatment and required everyone to take everything out to the curb and trash it. That was the landlord's right. Rhonda had no recourse. One of the things we see in Evicted is the struggle of individuals who work often at low-wage jobs. They live on the margins of homelessness. A cut in hours or a layoff can lead to an eviction. At MUM, we administer 2 eviction prevention funds, one through what's called Allied Partners, a group of congregations that work in the Allied Drive area, and the other one is through First Unitarian Society that focuses on the Badger Road area. The checks are capped at $250. People can only access it so many times every 2 years. They get referred to me, and I write the check. So I know the stories. I also know the landlords, and a lot of them are listed in Ian's report that you'll hear more about later. Charles and his wife lived in their apartment for over 5 years. Charles has severe kidney disease and was in the hospital for a few days, so he missed work. He doesn't have paid sick leave, which meant he lost income, which meant they fell behind in the rent, and now they were facing eviction. Leandra was in a car accident in August. The accident wasn't her fault, but the other driver was uninsured. She suffered a concussion and missed work, and again, doesn't have paid sick leave, so she lost income and fell behind on her rent. She decided to use, the reason she fell behind on her rent actually was because her car was damaged, and she needs her car for work. So she decided to take some of the rent money to pay for the car repairs so that she could at least keep her job and have a hope of catching up on the rent and keeping her housing. B left her abusive husband because of because of nuisance ordinances that are described in eviction. If B had stayed in the apartment with her abusive husband and called the police on him the next time he assaulted her, she could have been evicted for the call to the police under the nuisance ordinance. It doesn't matter that she was the victim. B opted to leave and became homeless, but she opted to leave because she didn't want an eviction showing up on Wisconsin's Circuit Court automated program. How many of you know CCAP? Okay. Usually, I don't know, it might be true here, and I don't want to be discriminatory. So how many of you in the process of thinking about dating someone have ever gone on CCAP and looked them up? There are actually a few hands. If you have ever had any kind of court activity, civil or criminal, you are on CCAP. And every landlord who gets a housing application looks on CCAP. And almost every employer I know who gets an employment application looks on CCAP. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves, is it anybody's business if Tilly, right? I remember Tilly from. So, is it anybody's business if Tilly got a parking ticket or a speeding ticket 10 years ago? I know you wouldn't, but is it anybody's business who's been divorced here? Is it anybody's business? And yet, it's all out there. And one of the things we should be scared about is that sometimes, depending on the information taken in CCAP, there's enough there for identity thieves to start to build themselves a new identity. Terry's a single mom. She's a veteran. She'd been laid off from work and fell behind on the rent. She was able to catch up on her rent except for the $35 late fee. And she was evicted with her 3 children for a $35 late fee. Desmond also points out in Evicted that just as the loss of a job can lead to an eviction can lead to the loss of a job. Sandy worked full-time at slightly above minimum wage. Her building was sold recently, and the new landlord began increasing rents and not renewing leases of the current tenants. Sandy's lease was not renewed. The landlord said it was because she didn't meet the new eligibility criteria, specifically that her credit score was too low, and no, it didn't matter that she had never been late on her rent. So her lease was not renewed. Sandy became homeless. She was able to find a new apartment, but it was significantly farther away from her job, and she relies on Metro to get to and from work. After several tardies at work because of the bus schedule, she was fired. As Desmond points out, it might be tempting sometimes to look at some of these stories, to look at eviction as someone's personal failure, but the reality is that it was the result of changes in tenant right laws and profit motive that resulted in Sandy's de facto eviction, and then a loss of employment, which then, of course, sets her up for an actual eviction. Desmond points out that housing costs should be no more than 30% of someone's income. That goal allows people to have housing, food, utilities, clothing. He points out that in the US, the number of poor renting families who spend 30% of their income on housing has declined, while the number of renting families paying 50% or more of their income has increased. In fact, as Desmond points out, since 1999, the median rent has gone up by 70%. 2/3 of renting families living below the poverty level receive no housing assistance at all. Only 1 in 4 who qualify for housing assistance get it because there isn't enough funding to fully fund housing assistance programs. In fact, in both Madison and Dane County, if you are applying for Section 8, you will wait for years. Those wait lists are frozen. You can't even get on the wait list right now. You have to enter a lottery for the chance to get on the list, for the chance to wait several years to move to the top. And if you live in a major metropolitan area, you may wait decades before you get a Section 8 voucher. Rose is elderly. Well, actually, I'm going to say one more thing. Even in Dane County and Madison, if you have a Section 8 voucher, and people who have worked in housing will tell you, that doesn't mean you get an apartment. Landlords don't have to accept those vouchers, but in Madison and Dane County, where we have an unhealthy vacancy rate of 2%, a healthy rate is 5%, which means it's really hard to find housing in Madison right now, rental housing. Several years ago, the city of Madison had a little kind of PowerPoint. The planning division went around showing all of the different building projects around the city that were receiving tax incremental financing and various forms of assistance. And in there, they talked about the mixed-use projects. 2,400 units of rental of apartments were included in those TIF projects. 2,400 apartments, not one of them classified as affordable. These are some of the policies and priorities that Desmond talks about in Evicted. Where we choose to use our money, what our budgets say about us morally. Rose is elderly. Her Social Security barely covers her rent. The apartment she lives in is not well insulated, and her utility bill last winter was exorbitant. She pays 70% on her housing before utilities and before the co-pays on her medication. Not surprisingly, she fell behind in her utilities. What might surprise some people is that if your utilities are turned off, it's cause for eviction. Most recently, we helped a family of 4, a mom, a dad, and 2 kids. Both parents work. They make $3,000 a month combined. And as we saw with our lien in Evicted, having kids doesn't always make finding housing easier, and in fact, it makes it harder. In the apartment they had, their neighbors didn't like the noise that their kids made when the kids were playing. The neighbors complained, and when it came time to renew the lease, the landlord refused, forcing the family into their car. They finally did, after a year of living in their car, find an apartment they can afford, a 2-bedroom apartment for $1,425 a month, almost half of their monthly income. This is one of the themes that we see in Evicted. As I said, that eviction and homelessness, as Desmond says, is not so much a result of personal attributes, but an inevitability of poverty that can include a lack of access to health care, job layoffs, minimum wage jobs that can't begin to pay the rents in Madison and Dane County, as well as other economic and systemic issues, including racism, which I know you're going to hear more about, disparities in some of the other presentations. Desmond also talks about what home means to us and our neighbors. It's our home, he says, where we plant roots, where we take off the masks that we wear all day, where we can be ourselves. It's intended to be our sanctuary. When we plant roots, Desmond writes, we take ownership of our community. We vote, we engage in community groups. Our children have stable schools. But when neighborhoods are decimated by eviction, things begin to unravel and lives are changed forever. The Hickory Lanes Mobile Home Park was located on Broadway in Monona, just off of Lake Monona. In 2007, the park owners decided to sell the property. They were trying to sell it to a developer who wanted to put up high-end condos. The park owners didn't tell the homeowners and the renters in the park that they planned on selling. And in fact, they continued to sell mobile homes to people who unwittingly gave them thousands of dollars for a home that was never going to be able to be moved. They didn't tell the tenants. They asked people to sign monthly leases, and we'll give you a rent break if you sign a monthly lease instead of that pesky 12-month lease. It was their way of gaming the tenants so that it would be easier to get rid of them once they announced that they were actually selling the park. The homeowners continued to rent. And the thing is, when I talk about them selling these homes, there's very few protections for people who own manufactured homes. And in fact, the only protection you have is that if you have your home already in a park, they can't make you move it because it's an old home or because it doesn't fit with the aesthetic. But if you do try to move it to any other park can say, no, your home is too old, no, your home is the wrong color, no, we don't like the awnings, whatever. So they continued to sell homes knowing that they were going to move, that they were going to sell this park. For the mobile homeowners in Hickory Lanes, which was an older park, that basically meant that most of their homes were too old to go anywhere else, even if they were in good conditions. The assessed fair market value of the homes, based on information provided by the City of Monona Planning and Development Office, put the homes' values ranging from $1,000 to $34,000. Most of the residents in Hickory Lanes believed in the American dream of homeownership. They had purchased their homes, they were paying rental on the lot and paying property taxes on the value of the actual home. For these homeowners, their investment was completely lost. In February of 2008, after it had become clear that the park owners intended to sell, the City of Monona began the process of creating a tax incremental financing district so that they could offer financial assistance through tax incremental financing to the developer. The City of Monona also called a meeting for the residents of the park and asked for some nonprofits to come and talk about the services that we could offer to the residents. That meeting would constitute the extent of assistance provided these families by the City of Monona. And in fact, the City of Monona actually asked the residents to call the nonprofits and invite them to the meeting. At the meeting, the residents were told the park was closing and they'd have to be out by March 1st. The residents worked to organize themselves, but they also had to spend their time focused on where they might live if the park did indeed close, which made it difficult to organize. Just as we saw in Evicted, when you're trying to figure out where you're going to sleep in 2 days, it's a little hard to worry about organizing your neighbors into some sort of coordinated action. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, to some extent. Kevin was one of the homeowners, a single dad of 2 small children. He worked full-time and was working on his bachelor's degree. He'd bought his home assessed at $13,000 6 years prior. He felt it was an affordable way to live while he paid tuition, and it also offered him an investment he thought that he could sell when he graduated from college and purchase a bigger home. Kevin and his daughters now faced eviction because they couldn't move their home, and if they couldn't move their home, the park owners were threatening to begin filing eviction notices. They did eventually find a 2-bedroom apartment, not in Monona, which meant that his children had to change schools. And they also had to pay higher rent, which meant Kevin had to drop out of college. As Desmond points out, eviction is detrimental to education as children change schools over and over and over again. And what we know from the social workers at TEP and from people who study in education, the educators, every time a child changes school, they lose months of progress. They lose months of progress. How do the kids ever get out of the hole? We have a child, she's in high school now, in our mentoring program for children who have an incarcerated parent. Her family moved 5 times in 1 year. She was in 5 different schools in 1 year. Even so, she managed to be an A-B student. What that really means is that she is a gifted student. She is a gifted student that no one will ever recognize as such because of the constant disruption caused to her life and the stress caused by eviction. Tiger lived at Hickory Lanes for 40 years. He was a veteran. He was drawn to the park for its proximity to the Yahara River and its fishing potential. Fishing was his love, especially after he became sober. Now in his 70s, Tiger also had stage 4 cancer. He was going to have to move from the home he owned and the neighbors he loved who looked in on him to a new place with no support network and a significantly higher cost. As Tiger worried about having to move, his health deteriorated rapidly. The stress and the chemo took its toll, and some of his neighbors really do believe he just gave up rather than face life without his beloved home. In order to create a tax incremental financing district, a city has to have a report that finds the district to be majority blighted. So the city of Monona hired a firm to do the blight study. The boundaries are drawn by cities when they do blight studies or tax incremental districts. So they can draw in whatever kind of configuration they want if they want to squeeze out certain buildings, certain neighborhoods. You can do that by drawing the boundaries in a TIF district around those. So they did the blight study. The park was in the blight study. The interesting thing about the blight study is that all of the findings of blight, all of the code violations listed in the Hickory Lanes Mobile Home Park had been long-standing violations that the tenants knew about. They told me about them, and I asked under Freedom of Information Act for copies of the last 25 years of the required annual inspections. Monona ordinance requires annual inspections of mobile home parks. So I asked for 25 years of those reviews. I got one from 1983. And in it, the owners of the park asked for all of the violations, all of the code violation requirements to be waived, and the city granted it. And now, in 2007, the city was using those same code violations. The park owners were using those same code violations that they said were no big deal, give us an exception. Oh my gosh, we have to blight this. Look at all these code violations. That's how you play the game. So the other thing that was happening is that the landlords just stopped fixing things, and you read that in Evicted as well. And some tenants started leaving. As it became clear that the tenants were going to lose everything, that they were going to have to move, some of them did start moving out. They left behind their homes abandoned because they couldn't find another park to take them. Thieves started coming in and stripping the homes of their skirting and anything that they could sell for scrap metal. As more people moved out of their homes, others began squatting in the abandoned homes, and some of those squatters were using the homes as a place to deal drugs. Residents who were still there tried to organize a neighborhood watch, but they were caught in a catch-22 because if they called the police on the criminal activity, it further supported the finding of blight, and it kicked in the nuisance ordinance that would have allowed the landlords to evict them more quickly. Their neighborhood that they loved so much had become a dangerous place, and there wasn't a thing they could legally do about it without essentially causing themselves to be forced out. As part of the TIF district, the developer could have built in the cost of paying the homeowners for their home and relocation costs. That didn't happen. In fact, the deal fell through before anything ever happened because the housing bubble burst. And the park sat vacant until 2012. That's how 72 people in the city of Monona became homeless in 2007. With no compassion from the city and with no legal recourse. At the same time all of this was going on, the city of Monona had also taken over several nuisance apartment buildings that they wished to redevelop. We asked the city to make repairs at least to some of the units in one of the buildings so that the people from Hickory Lanes who couldn't find apartments could move in, and they declined. They said, nope, we're not going to do that. Ironically, this is the part of the story that I actually find humorous. At the same time all of this was going on, I started attending what was called the City of Monona Family Attraction Committee, who spent a great deal of time wringing their hands about why there were not more small, young families moving into the city of Monona. And then, in the next breath, would say, how are we going to get rid of all these little 1950s and 60s ranch houses with one-car garages? Nobody wants these. You might be able to tell I still have I still hold a bit of a grudge against Monona. This stuff happens all the time. Tenants, poor people who are renters get played, get exploited all the time. What we see in Evicted is how eviction drives people into less stable housing, housing that's further down the continuum of poverty and safety, housing that has holes in the walls, windows and walls, exposed wiring, lead paint. It was true for Rhonda. It was certainly true for most of the residents at Hickory Lanes, both those who were moving out and the very desperate homeless people who were moving into abandoned mobile homes that had no doors and no windows and half the metal pipes were missing. Desmond wrote that, quote, the poor are constantly exposed to evidence of their own irrelevance. And I think that quote aptly describes the experiences of the individuals and families that Desmond followed and Evicted, and the stories and experiences of the men and women and families we work with at MOM. It's my hope that what we read in Evicted and what we hear tonight will serve as a reminder of how the richest country in the world still denies fundamental rights to our poorest brothers and sisters. How there is no other advanced democracy that has the level of poverty that our country has. It's my hope that we'll better understand the scope of the crisis, the real impact of eviction on our community, and that we'll begin focusing on solutions that address the systemic issues surrounding evictions, and that we might also see what Matthew Desmond sees even after all of this, hope. So thank you again for inviting me, and I have the distinct honor of introducing David Long, who's going to talk numbers.
Thanks, Linda, for sharing that. I hope my numbers don't seem too dispassionate after hearing some of the sort of heart-wrenching stories that you've experienced and seen firsthand. Grab a pointer here. So my name's Dave Long. I'm the Associate Director of the Applied Population Lab at UW, and we work a lot with demographic data and data that comes from the U.S. Census describing social and economic conditions and change over time and variations across place. So I'm going to try to lay out for you a little bit of background that just kind of depicts a little bit about what's going on in Dane County and Madison over the last 35 years mostly, and kind of sets the stage for some of the conditions that we're going to hear more about later from Steve and Ian. So I'll jump in here. Can everybody hear me okay? Is the mic good? Okay. One thing I like to do when I start a presentation is to just tell you real quick everything I'm going to say. And so that's what this first slide is about, in case some of my main points kind of get lost in the details of the weeds. I'm just going to run through it real quick to start off. Looking at Madison and Dane County, most of you probably know, if you've lived here for a while, that we're experiencing pretty strong, as the Midwest goes, population growth. We've also seen, just in some of the most recent data, a real steep decline in rental vacancy, and that affects, rents. It affects landlords' ability to discriminate or be more selective, highly selective about who they rent to. We've seen over several decades increases in the rent, the median rent over time, even controlling for inflation. We are seeing an increase in low-income population and a growth. I don't have data for this on Madison and Dane County per se, but there's lots of evidence on the national and state level that there's growing inequality, and most people have heard something about that in the last few years as well. It's a hot button topic in electoral politics as well. You've heard the term rent burden tonight, with the share of people's income when it exceeds 30% of their income that they have to spend toward their rent. You're considered rent burdened at that point, and we see a growing share of renters in Madison and Dane County who are rent burdened. And we see an increase in race and ethnic groups that are at higher risk for poverty, at high risk for discrimination, at higher risk for incarceration, and a host of other social conditions that are going to make housing instability or uncertainty a problem for them as well. Similarly, increase in high-risk household types, and by that I mean single-parent households where there's not two earners per se in a household. There may not even be one earner in the household. There's more mouths to feed with the same or less income coming in, so that puts you at a disadvantage when it comes to making rent payments. And I'll show you a couple maps at the end about some of the distribution of assisted housing and the areas in the city that are higher rent burden. So, and one caution about these data. Most of them are point-in-time estimates that derive from the decennial census at the end of the decade, and more recently we have data from the American Community Survey, which are a little less reliable. They're based on a sample, and so the numbers aren't perfect, and I didn't present the margins of error in the charts here, but suffice it to say that they're not 100% sure, and they're in many cases the best information we've got. So I'll go ahead and share them with you tonight, but know that even data themselves are not completely objective or perfect in any sense. So here's the population change, and this is probably I hope it's not, it might be the only really optimistic chart I have to present for you tonight. I mean, the population change over several decades for the city in Dane County is experiencing pretty strong growth, and that's a good sign. Most people who follow the economy and economic indicators associate that with a robust and strong economy. So by and large, we think of that as a good thing, and I think of it as a good thing in part because it means that maybe there's some resources in terms of jobs, employment opportunities, revenue from employers and businesses and property owners that are moving to this area that might be used to help solve some of the problems that we're facing. And this is one of the items that I just included, just stumbled on the last couple of days, and found it so striking. The rental vacancy rate is, and I think this relates in part from the housing bubble and the construction boom that was going on during that time. We had really pretty normal or respectable vacancy rates. I've heard housing planners say 5% is a nice number to shoot for. But then you see in the last year, this was the last year I have data for is 2015, we see a precipitous decline for Madison and Dane County. So really, really low vacancy rates. And again, landlords can be very selective about who they rent to under those conditions. And you also see rent rates going up. At the same time, we have a growing share of the population below the poverty level. Let's see. So over the course of the decades, the 35 years shown here, we're going from about 13.5% to 17.5% in Madison, which is about a 30% increase over 35 years. So not insignificant. And the poverty rate was 24,000 for less than 24,000 for a family of 4. So you're talking about pretty low income when you talk about federal poverty rate. These are the data I mentioned on income inequality. Again, this chart starts at 0.3 and it shows an index that's designed to capture income inequality, but pretty steep increase nonetheless in income inequality in the US as a whole and for the state of Wisconsin. And for Madison and Dane County, we don't have a lot of time series data for that, but we can see that the income inequality level for Madison and Dane County is kind of in line with the US and Wisconsin as a whole. Here again, we see the rent burden statistic, so the number of percentage of renters who are rent burdened or spending 30% or more of their income on rent, and a steep increase starting that shows up in the 2010 number I have, and drops a little bit. You can see by 2015 with some of the recovery, but still pretty high level. Almost 50% of renters who are experiencing rent burden. And one thing to keep in mind with the Madison data is we are including student households there. So not students in dorms, but students who are living in a housing unit or apartment with other students. And so they're inflating the number a bit for Madison. And that matters to the poverty data I'll show too. The racial composition of Madison over the last 30 years, these 3 decades shown, increasing diversity, increasing populations of color, Black, Latinos, Hispanic, Latino or Hispanics, and Asians, all increasing pretty significantly. But what's more striking than that, I think, is when you look at the race and ethnic composition of children. So persons under 18, much faster increase in diversity. And again, here you're talking about kids who are disproportionately affected by eviction and housing insecurity, disproportionately affected by poverty too. So there's a lot at stake here when we look at nearly 50% of the population being population of color, population of kids. That's a pretty big concern, both from what they're experiencing now and what the population's going to look like in the future. It's important to get things right, in effect. Poverty rates by race, I've shown here again over a 35-year span. There's some bumps and dips in these charts. One thing that was a little surprising to me was that if you look at where things were, poverty rates by race, back in 1980, things haven't changed all that much for most of the groups shown, although they've gone through some transitions during that period. A lot of what we're seeing at the the city and county level in terms of poverty increase is really a shift in the proportion of people of color. Increase in people of color with their poverty rates not declining means we're going to see a greater poverty rate as a whole for the population. Another really important societal level change that is also borne out in Madison is single-parent households. This is the number of kids who are in single-parent households, and huge, huge, 300% increase in effect since 1970. And again, going back to some of the research that Desmond has done and cites in his work, Evicted, parents, single parents, families with kids are much more likely to face eviction and to have worse outcomes in the court. And kids really, even when you control for all the other, how far behind they are in rent, what race they are, having kids means you're going to have a worse outcome, which is kind of one of the more interesting, surprising, and disturbing facets of his research. And by the way, this percentage of single-parent households, it's true across all race groups. We see differences within race groups in the share of households that are single-parent. But we've seen really, if you break this down by race, you see each of the lines showing a steep increase across the decades shown here. And here's one of the maps. Again, downtown, you're kind of focused, you're seeing a lot of student households that are facing high rent burden, and not to diminish the debt that students are piling up as they pay a lot of money for Madison rents, but probably in most cases, when we're talking about eviction, we're more focused on families and low-income families in particular that are more in some of these more peripheral areas, neighborhoods. These are census block groups outside the Beltline or just inside the Beltline that are, in many cases, 75% or more of the renters there are what we would call rent burden. And then one more set of maps. Desmond mentioned Section 8 vouchers as a possible tool, possible solution. The expansion of that program. And one of the things that's kind of interesting when you look at the map, the top left map is the Section 8 voucher map, and that's just the total number of vouchers in each census block group. And you see the pattern there is a much more dispersed pattern. So there are people who are getting housing assistance through a voucher program are much more evenly distributed across the city, and that's kind of important from a policy standpoint too. If you look at the map immediately below it, the CDA housing program, there you've got specific apartment complexes where housing assistance is very, very concentrated, and that can be useful from a management standpoint, but then you've also got people, sort of geographically concentrated poverty, which is an issue in itself. That's all I'm going to say for you, except that there's a few more resources I've posted up here that are on the Applied Population Lab website. You're welcome to browse those. And with that, I'll hand it off to Steve so we can keep moving.
So I would also like to thank the organizers of this for the opportunity to present to you. I'm going to talk mostly about the rental housing market in Dane County and Madison to think about the stories, the important stories that Linda told. These are going to be more numbers and more charts, but they are the sort of the framework that is the setting by which those stories play out. So overall, in City of Madison, most of the households are renters, and that's increasing quickly over the next, has been increasing quickly over the last 5 to 10 years. In fact, the city's housing report they recently put out said 90% of the new household growth in the last maybe 5 to 8 years has been rental households. And this shows some of that growth. You see over time where there's the largest number of rental household growth are those with incomes above $75,000 and those below $20,000 over time. And at the lower end, the middle range is decreasing a little bit. So you have say 2,700 households with incomes below 20,000 were added to the city of Madison. So as these households are moving in, then what is the supply of housing that's being created? Well, you see in this chart that you see the effect of the recession. This is just multifamily, so multifamily isn't all rental, but it's a good proxy for rental. You see during this period of time, you see pretty low production of multifamily buildings. At the same time, the number of people moving in to the city of Madison is still maybe 1,500 households every year, and so they really had a lot of households moving in or being started by children, moving out on their own, but a lot less production in housing units. You can see that we're starting to catch up as this line goes up, and this is just for the city of Madison, has been building. However, of course, as Linda pointed out, a lot of those new units are higher end, higher cost units that are not meeting the needs of the lower income. Dave talked about the student, population and how they show up in the numbers. Let's see if we get this pointer. So the city of Madison, this comes from their housing report, and in the households under 25,000, they estimate that about this amount here in the Madison as compared to Dane County are students. Nevertheless, you still see a large number of households with below this $50,000 a house. That's 50,000 is probably about 80% of the area median income. And so we already saw this. This is just another slide showing the vacancy rate. That this time it's the spread of vacancy rates and zip codes across the city of Madison. And one thing to add to the vacancy rate story is you see that spread diminishing. So it used to be, maybe downtown housing market was usually pretty tight, but in the outskirts of Madison or elsewhere, you might have an easier time finding housing. But as the overall squeeze in housing, that's the vacancy rate is low now across all of the city. Adding a little bit more just to the rent cost story that Dave went over a little bit. This is a chart comparing the rise in median rent. So the blue line from 2005 to 2014, and the red line is what the rent would be just with the regular compared to inflation. So you can see main point here is rent has been going up faster than the overall cost of living. Yet for many people, incomes have been stagnant or going down. So we talk a lot about cost burden. Sometimes it's helpful just to describe some situations about what that means. And so in this case, if a low-income rental household is one that's, for the city of Madison, earning less than 80% of the median income, now that's not that poor. That's not the type of household income that Linda was describing. And that might be a two-income household, each earning $12 an hour, working full-time. That household would, if they were allocating 30% of their income for housing, would be able to afford $1,250 per month. If they're paying more than that, they would be cost burdened. However, if both of those earners were working full-time earning minimum wage, then they could only afford $750 per month. And that would put that household closer to the poverty level. And in 1/3 of all of the new rental households in Madison, I think I touched on this earlier, did earn less than $20,000, which would be the equivalent of 30% of the area median income. So what does that mean in terms of the scale of the number of households that are affected, that are considered cost burdened? Well, this shows you for the city of Madison and for Dane County, and shows you the total. So it's needs a little bit of explaining. So the blue line is the total number of rental households, in this case with incomes between 35 to 50% of the area median income in the city of Madison and Dane County. So for example, city of Madison, 5,790 rental households were in that income area, and almost all of them were cost burdened, and same thing in Dane County. And then when you get, this is for those below 30%. So now again, this is someone pretty much basically people at the very low poverty level. Again, large numbers of cost burdened rental households, over 6,000, over almost 9,000 in Dane County. And there's 12,000 renter households who are paying more than 50% of their income on rent. So this is, again, getting at this kind of stories that Linda was talking about. And so she told the stories of the individuals, and now you can see sort of the scale of the magnitude that we're facing. And this represented over 44% of all renter households at that level. So it's a significant scale. This is I'm not going to go over this. I think it will require too much explaining. It's sort of the distribution of the housing affordability gap. So I'll move on, and now I want to talk about the so you have a lot of people who are struggling to pay their rent. Well, what is the gap in the number of units that would need to be provided to close that affordability gap? In other words, if we could magically produce enough housing so that nobody was at a price that nobody was paying 30% of their income, what would that be? So for all the households below 50% of the median income, so it's really kind of like the bottom quartile, there in the city of Madison, out of the 17,000 some renter households that have those incomes, there's only 13,600 that are actually considered affordable. So you have this gap here. In other words, you would need to have 17,000 units at more affordable units if you were going to close that affordability gap. And in Dane County, you would need another about 11,000. But if you get to the lower end, you can see this is a much larger gap. You have. So in Dane County, we have 19,000 some rental households that have incomes below, basically at the poverty line, but there's only less than 4,000 units that are affordable to them. So that's sort of another way of picturing the scale of the problem. And with that, I will turn it over to Ian.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and for the organizers for all your work in gathering us here. And I'm aware of the fact that we've been sitting for a while, and so I was going to try something with you. So if in your chair, if you're interested in just reaching up as high as you can for a little bit, maybe Maybe moving over to one side, moving over to the other side, doing a little wave. All right. And then if you want to raise up your legs and just kind of twist your ankles around a little bit, just do a little, a little roll. And then if you want to maybe turn to the person to your right and introduce yourself to the person on your right, just twisting. That's awkward. Okay, and if you could turn to the person on your left now and twist the other way, and I realize you're all twisting each other's shoulders. Okay, all right. Just figured I wanted to move a little. All right, well, again, yeah, thank you so much for being here, everyone. My name is Ian, and I'm at the UW in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. And this past summer, from June until, I guess, the last couple of weeks ago, we've been working on a report here that essentially brings Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, into the context here of Dane County. And you can find this book on the Go Big Read website. If you go to the UW's Go Big Read website, and then you go to the resources section, that's where you can find this report. And if you have a hard time finding it, or if you need further instruction, come find me afterwards, and I can help you find it. So there are many people that contributed to this. So these are the co-authors here. You can see all their names. All right. So a little introduction to the data that we worked with. The Tenant Resource Center is a nonprofit in Madison, and they work in all of Dane County. And every time that there is an eviction case, they will send out a mailer to that person and say, this is who we are, these are the services we offer, and just know that these are your rights and we can help. And because they've been doing that over the years, they have all of these records of every single eviction case that's ever happened since back to 2000. And so those were all kept in various Excel spreadsheets, and what we did was brought those all into one place. And then all of a sudden we had evictions case data from 2000 until 2016. So one of the people that was working on this project, Revel Sims, he works on evictions, and he believes that this is actually one of the most complete in terms of length of time and number of evictions of any database in the country, actually, which is pretty exciting. So, and in that 16-year period or so, there are over 40,000 evictions that have taken place in Dane County. So on average, it's about 2,500 per year. And over time, so from 2000 to 2011, it has gradually increased. And then from 2011 until the present, it's slightly decreased. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. But there have been a lot of legal changes in the last while from the state legislature. And some of the things that we heard in the past presentations. And so often people will be leaving out of other reasons than having an official eviction. So whether that means a non-renewal, or that means an increase in rent to the point where you can't pay it anymore, or just not wanting to have that record in the system. Because interestingly and tragically, if there's an eviction case that's filed against you that says you owe $35, and you come to court and you pay those $35, and the landlord is able to still evict you, and that goes on your record for 20 years. And so that is a great injustice. And so that is often why people, at least those that we interviewed many housing providers, and they conveyed that decrease from 2011, which was when a lot of those new legislations were getting passed, that could have been one of the reasons why that happened, that decrease. So back to introducing the data. These are not evictions that have actually been executed. These are eviction cases. So that's something to keep in mind. That's the information we had access to. What actually happened after that is yet to be determined. So, and the block group. So the U.S. Census, they collect data across the country. And there's the census tract, which people are pretty familiar with. And then the block group is one step down from that. And you can think of it like a neighborhood. It's normally about 1,500 people. It varies from about 600 to 3,000, but it's about sort of a neighborhood size. And that's small enough that you can actually have some demographic information come out of it, but not so small that you can say, oh, I think I know who that person is next door to me in my block. So that's why much of the information you've heard tonight is at that block group level. So that's what we're working with. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So I'm going to go into this a little bit more in depth as we move along, but these are sort of the overarching major findings that we had. Race is the most important factor when explaining eviction cases in Dane County. Income alone is not enough to describe that, and we'll explain why we suggest that in the paper. And there's a small group of sort of evictors, so the plaintiffs in the case, those that are actually initiating that eviction process. It's a fairly small group that account for over half of the evictions in Dane County, so we'll talk about that a little bit. And here we go. Oh, that's a little, well, you get the idea. So, so this is a table of neighborhoods. You can see the neighborhood name. Is that right? Okay, yeah, so there's the neighborhood name. This here is the percent non-white. So you can see it's ranked in terms of the most non-white and this is the top 10 in Dane County. And you'll notice over here, this is how many evictions, and then this is the rank in terms of where it fell in Dane County. And the top 10 neighborhoods of color have also corresponded with the top 6 neighborhoods that receive the most evictions. So those are highly, highly correlated. And so you also have some oddballs like Eagle Heights, which is the university housing, which only has 10 evictions. So high community of color, but it's only 10 evictions. So on to the next slide. Here's a map of, here's the percentage non-white, and then all these dots represent a location of an eviction. So this is a correlation index between the percent non-white, median household income, and percent renters over a household over 65, so seniors here. And you'll see this is, so essentially what a correlation is, it means when two variables are very connected to one another. When one goes up, you can expect that the other one will go up, and so on. So if it's 1, it means that any time that something happens with one variable, it is guaranteed to happen in that other variable. If it's 0, it means something happens and nothing happens. So to see a correlation of 7.228 that means that there's a very, very close connection between percentage non-white and evictions. And it's a very high statistical significance. It means that the error, this sort of what we don't know about the data, it counts for very, very little of this relationship. So, and as we know from reading the news and other things, often it's a whole mix of different variables, right? So you have race. Yes, please. Yep. I could. I'm not used to talking. Oh, it's much louder that way, isn't it? All right. Thanks for raising your hand. In fact, if I'm talking too quickly or if I'm talking too softly, please raise your hand. That'd be helpful for me. We ran a statistical model that included not only race, so percentage non-white, but also percentage seniors and percentage of rental units in the block group, And let me just make sure I have all these variables. So we have household income, number of rental units, percent seniors, and percent non-white. And in that model, taking into account all of those variables and controlling for those variables, race continued to be the most significant variable, and the others were not, some of them were insignificant, and some of them barely contributed to that. So in this model, for every 10% increase in non-white population in a neighborhood, you saw 77 additional evictions added. So that is a pretty significant number. So let's move on to the next slide here. Great. So questions? Okay. Now income. So these are the top 10 income, I guess the lowest of 10 income neighborhoods in Madison. And you'll see that all of them fall on the UW campus. So it's interesting to see that the evictions rates here are actually, you can see, so this is their rank in terms of the overall, and many of them are above the average. The average is about 160. So many of them are above average, but when you think back, the other ones were in the thousands. So the actual eviction rate is significantly lower, and that in large part is because students, as we know, have access to parental resources and other things. And so ideally in further analysis, we would like to be able to parse out the student population from other low-income populations as we continue to do our work, but that's a factor. So so this is seniors in evictions. Unfortunately, over the last few years, there's been a lot of press about seniors across the country being evicted. In San Francisco, there were a couple of cases of people who were over 100 who were evicted, and it just deep injustice. And what is heartening to hear, at least on a large scale, this is not a factor in it did not show up in Dane County as a major factor in explaining evictions. However, really so it doesn't show up in sort of aggregate. As we're looking at the whole county, it doesn't show up. But that doesn't mean that there aren't specific individual cases of this going on. It just doesn't show up in this way. And really any eviction of somebody who is older is not something that should be happening in my mind. So this is, let's sort of turn to who is actually doing this evicting. So this here is a distribution of each landlord is sort of a tick along this line. So some you can see you sort of have a small group that is contributing to the vast majority of the evictions in Dane County. So the top 100 contribute to 53%. So over half of all evictions cases since 2000 have been initiated by 100 people. So that's pretty stark. And the top two here, Madison Property Management and Wisconsin Management, those two account for 7% just alone. So, and then there are a lot of people that are sort of mom and pop shops that have maybe 1 or 2 units, and 90% of the evictors, the actual plaintiffs in these cases, are less than 10 evictions over the last. So you can see that there's a small crew of people that we're talking about that are doing these evictions. So now, so here is a table of who these people are, who these management companies are. Wisconsin Management, they do Dane County Public Housing. They manage for Dane County Public Housing. Ray Peterson, who maybe many have read about in the State Journal and Cap Times as being sort of prosecuted for his landlord practices. He's number 11 in this list. Dane County, or the Madison Community Development Authority of City of Madison is up there as well. It's number 8. Porchlight is as well. And so it's important to note that many of these nonprofit housing evictors and public housing evictors are dealing with very vulnerable populations. So while they are landing in that top tier and should be held accountable for that, it's often because they're working with some of the most vulnerable populations. So that's sort of where we stand with that. All right. Well, I don't know whether you've been following over the last few years. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Paul. Great. It is so much louder when I hold it near my face. Over the last few years, there have been a number of studies, the Race to Equity report, that looked at 40 different indicators of wellness, everything from high school graduation rates to a number of different factors. And it shows that in Dane County, there are two Madisons. There's a Madison where life is pretty good, and that is a primarily a white Madison, very well educated, all of us, right? And then there's another Madison that is primarily people of color, and it's a lot harder to get by in that Madison. And unfortunately, these findings that we came up with really confirm that on the housing side of things. And I grew up in Madison, and I really love Madison. And hearing Linda talk and doing this work, I really feel a brokenness. Like it feels really difficult to sit with this, and I just see that there's a real need for healing in our community and to bridging these gaps. And these are uncomfortable conversations. Talking about race and bias and poverty, this is difficult stuff. And I guess I would ask all of us to continue to engage with these topics, even if it makes us uncomfortable, and to notice the ways that bias comes up in ourselves and in the people that we love, and to bring honesty to that and awareness, and most of all, compassion, because I think that there can be a lot of guilt with all of this, and I think that it's difficult to stay there, and so I would invite you to do that. And another layer of it is that there's a lot of struggle here. There's a lot of pain that's described here, and I think that it's very important to donate to the Tenant Resource Center and to volunteer, to tutor in South Madison. But I think that often when we come with the intention of helping, sometimes we miss out on the opportunity to listen. And in those, I guess another thing would be to look for the strengths in communities of color and listen for those strengths as much as we see this struggle, because the strengths are also there, and that is the sort of the birthplace of the solutions. And many of the plans that have come out from Reverend G with the Justified Anger Coalition and others have talked about this sort of invest in our community and listen to who we are. And I guess I would invite all of us to, in our day-to-day lives, as we have people that are serving us dinner, or as we just bump into people out and about, just try to just pause and have a casual conversation with somebody who's from a different economic, political, or ethnic background from you. And that, I think, is part of the solution as well, just us as Madisonians. Anyway, thank you. And I guess I have some hard solutions for housing as well, but maybe it's time for some questions. Does that sound good?
Thank you, Ian. Just to summarize a couple things, and I'm going to do it real quickly, and I'm not even going to offer my closing remarks. How's that? Because I want you to have a chance to ask questions. So, I think one of the things in looking at all these presentations and reading Evicted, the intersectionality of all these issues, that it's really tempting to say evictions happen because somebody didn't pay their rent, Well, but then we have to look at why they didn't pay their rent. Then we have to look at why the landlord, when they did catch up on their rent, decided to evict this person and not this person, or decided to renew this lease and not that lease. So we have to look at the intersectionality. We have to look at the availability of housing. We really have to look at some of our own budget priorities in our communities, where we give financing assistance to development. In Evicted, he talks about, and it ties into the conclusions that Ian was making, about $41 billion are spent on Section 8 vouchers in the United States. But those of us who are homeowners, that we get about $171 billion in tax breaks through the mortgage interest deduction on our income taxes. So those of us who own homes get $171 billion in housing assistance, and the people who most need it, we spend as a country $41 billion. We could give everyone who lives below the poverty level or at the poverty level a Section 8 voucher for about $22 billion more. So these are the things we have to think about when we talk about this. I brought some handouts here if you're interested at a county level, some things you can do for action, but now I'd like to open it up for questions. Anyone have questions?
Testing.
Since Madison declared housing to be a right in 2011, what has changed?
Nothing. From my perspective and the people that we work with, what I see, nothing. We still spend money where we spend it on development, on high end. We still are passing ordinances that penalize people who are homeless. We now give out $469 trespassing tickets to anyone who's on the grounds of the city-county building after hours, except probably if I went down there looking dressed like this and sat there, I would not get the ticket, right? But if I wore my baseball clothes and had a trash bag with my belongings in it, I would probably get that ticket. So I don't think anything.
I guess I would just add to that the city of Madison and Dane County have increased their investments in affordable housing. They've each created affordable housing funds and put money into it. They are increasing the number of units that are affordable housing. That said, and that's a good thing, and that's needed, of course, and I applaud the city and county for doing that. The scale of the production is still very far from the need. You saw that gap that I presented. Maybe we're across the county producing 100 new units of affordable housing a year, but clearly, you need to quintuple that or more to meet the need. And then also, a lot of the housing that's considered labeled affordable is not it's not really affordable to that lower end of the below 30% of the area median, people at poverty level. If someone's earning 80%, a household of four is earning 80% of the median income and can qualify for affordable housing, they may have an income of 60-some thousand a year. Which means that they can afford to actually, pay rents of $1,000. So those are sometimes the units that are being affordable, being officially classified as affordable. Now, increasingly, they're trying to build in rents at housing units at lower cost, down at that 30%. More of the tax credit. Housing units are trying to do that. The formula from the state that provides the funding encourages that. But all said and done, efforts are being made, but the scale is not even nearly approaching the scale that's needed.
Hi. It seems to me that the number of eviction events per unit time be greater now than it was when I was here as a student 40 years ago. You're talking to an older generation. What's the incentive and what's the satisfaction of dealing with all these eviction events? It seems to me a little puzzling as to why people want to spend their time making decisions that come out of Dixon's and a variety of 19th century writers' events. It seems like we're going out and it's a masochistic way of living as a society. We try to set things up for a better outcome, and we change and deny ourselves, and we still have more outcomes that are unpleasant. I think it's a fair question to ask as to why we're doing what we're doing, and I'll just like to get the reaction. Is anyone else puzzled in this room as to why people want to work in this kind of a society? Question mark.
So is your question why do evictions happen? Is that the
Is that the
question?
No, it's why people want to participate in a society in increasing numbers where evictions happen.
Is the question why do people move to Madison if there are evictions happening? Okay. Okay.
It's why we're having an increase in evictions per unit time, and why do people want to participate in being landlords
Okay.
in this kind of a society where you're making decisions that are not who should I bring in, but rather who should I evict, which is a much less satisfying way to spend your time
Absolutely.
and make your income. That's
Absolutely.
what I'm trying to understand. Now, you demonstrated in your talk this afternoon or evening that you have really studied this thoroughly. I'm trying to imagine why people want to participate in this in increasing numbers. And I'll ask you first of all, is that a fair question?
I think it's a very fair question, and so what I hear is why are people participating in a system like this if it is implicating people? People are needing to evict people. This is something that has a cost.
This seems unsustainable to me.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So before we tumble into a oblivion or a dislocated society, can't we analyze this and find a way that it can be changed and avoided in the future? It seems like it's almost inevitable.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it is. I'm asking, now that you're studying it, do you feel it's inevitable?
I don't think it's inevitable. There have been historical periods of time where the commitment publicly to building public housing, not just vouchers in the private market, but truly public housing, has been significantly higher. And that has had a very different outcome in terms of the way that the market plays out and the way that people have options. And I lived in Canada for a very long time, and there, public housing doesn't have the same stigma or history as it does here. And that's the case in many other countries where it's low but also medium income, and it's very it's not something that it's thought of as these sort of slum high-rise buildings, and that is something that if we as a people decided that was a priority for us, we could make that happen. And I absolutely agree that and I think that Desmond did a very good job of showing the humanity of everyone involved in this system and the way that the landlords and the tenants are really hurting in this process and also having to have a pretty tough skin in that process as well. And it is a broken system, and I think that if we can ask our elected officials to have this be a priority, that could be I don't think in all of the media on the presidential election, I don't think I've heard one discussion of housing, and I wish that could be different.
Another question.
Almost on the same order that you just got finished with. No, I'm just sitting here and wondering, the landlords, it seems like they have a second profession of seeing how many people they can evict, and the next person that comes into the apartment, can they raise their rents? You know what I mean? Let's get rid of him. Maybe we can raise our rent and get more money out of them. Now, maybe I should say, I'm originally from Chicago. In my profession, I dealt with the Public Housing Authority. So I know about high-rise slums. And to me here too, let me go further by saying, where are the politicians? Where are the legislators? Where are the leaders of the community? What are they? You're asking us to do things. I mean, being involved, my wife and I did things for folks like that. But here, what are they doing?
Well, I think one of the things that both Desmond talks about in the book and what we've seen is, and it's been referenced in the slides, the legislature since 2011 has stripped away almost every tenant protection that existed in the state of Wisconsin. And they did it at the state level and then prohibited local municipalities, cities and counties, from passing their own ordinances that provided more rights to the tenants than the state did. So one of the things that our legislators are currently doing is feeding exactly into this vicious system of churning people in and out, especially in low-income neighborhoods, for this profit that can be made in these neighborhoods with these properties by exploiting people. So one thing, legislators have to be held accountable. Part of the problem is some of the people who are in our legislature who are proposing these bills are people who are landlords. They have a profit motive in passing legislation that gives them all the power, and the people who pay them money to live in their property, no power. And so we need to hold elected officials accountable. We need to, and Steve's absolutely right, the city and the county have invested more funding in affordable housing, but we need much more. And so we should be asking at Common Council and Dane County Board and Dane County Executive and mayoral forums, what's your budget next year going to include for the development of affordable housing? How are you defining affordable housing? And proportionately, how does that compare to the tax incremental financing and the breaks that we'll be giving developers who are putting in higher end housing? So let's hold their feet to the fire at a local level as well to put more funding into it. There are a whole host of ways that Dane County and the city of Madison could have put more money into both human services and housing. They chose consistently not to do it because they were afraid that people would not vote for them because it would be a fee increase or a tax increase. Other communities have done things like vacant and abandoned registration fees particularly for banks that were sitting on foreclosed on properties to make sure they kept them up to code, but also to make them pay a registration fee every 6 months that they didn't sell the building. And that money went into affordable housing trust funds. But Dane County wasn't willing to do it. They weren't willing to do a vehicle registration fee of $15 so they could take property tax money that was in the road fund, and put it actually into housing issues, and they could just use that vehicle registration fee from those of us who use the roads on road repair. So there are things we can hold local officials accountable for too, because I wish I could remember the exact quote, but William Sloane Coffin, who is a United Church of Christ theologian, talked about, we shouldn't overly rely on our elected officials for morality, because their bottom line inclination is going to be to get reelected versus operating purely in the social good or for the common good. And so it really is up to us to hold their feet to the fire.
Okay, there's a question over there that's been waiting. Yeah.
I'm curious about the issues of income versus housing, and specifically, what impact would a raise to $15 minimum wage have in this area?
Well, one of the part data points that I presented was if there were two income earners earning minimum wage, and they would be able to afford a rent at $750 a month. If they were to increase, if they got a raise to $12 an hour, they would be able to increase what they could afford to $1,250. So that you can see that even an increase of that amount goes a huge way towards making housing more affordable. And that boost in, say, minimum wage would ripple throughout the economy in a lot of other ways too. That's one little piece of an answer to your question.
Dave, I think you were going to say something, and then I have something to say also. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, Madison did have a living wage ordinance that was passed locally, and the legislature passed some subsequent overarching. There was a living wage ordinance passed in Madison a few years back, and the legislature subsequently passed an overarching legislation. I've forgotten what the tool is, but basically prohibiting local entities from, similarly to the, but it's for city employees, yeah. Oh, and contractors. Oh, sorry. So there, and to some extent, municipalities' hands are tied in that, but there's other ways to put pressure on employers, and certainly they, as employers and contractor of those local entities, can be held to higher standards. So.
I have an observation and a question. My observation is that most of us here, when we complete a census or some other questionnaire, I think most of us check off on race, something the equivalent of white. However, race in the charts and graphs apparently refers to people of color. I'm not a demographer, and I haven't chosen the terminology that demographers use, but race as a statistic on the graphs we've seen implies people of color, although race is something that we're all a race of one kind or another. So I just wonder about that being a kind of biased word. That's a biased word. That's just an observation. My question relates to the senior living chart. And there were two references, one to Oakwood Village West and one to Coventry. And does that refer to the fact that there are a lot of seniors living in those neighborhoods? That doesn't reflect, or does it reflect evictions from those senior living communities? I think that seemed to me to raise that question.
Great questions. I guess I'll stand too. So to deal with your second question first, because they're census, they're block groups, and they normally just have a number associated with them, and so to make them recognizable, we put a neighborhood name associated with it, and those neighborhood names were ones that it was pretty clear that Oakwood Village West was accounting for probably the vast majority of that particular block groups, above 65. And it was not to do with the actual just that building, and it also wasn't saying that it did have an eviction number associated with it, but those were actually fairly low numbers for those ones. And I guess to bring up your second or your first point, I think that sometimes sometimes you hear the language racialized communities, and that I think speaks to the fact that often non-white communities are understood as being other, and white is sort of understood as just white. It sort of has this, and so often I agree it is misleading language to say race versus non-white populations, but I think that sometimes the language of racialized means that these are communities that are identified as non-white and have to deal with that sort of label. So.
Okay. Go ahead. One more brief question.
All right. Well, I'm basically saying that I think you should feel very good that you got out the turnout you got tonight to discuss this subject, which is uncomfortable for everyone, because it appears like the America that we knew when those of us were in our earlier wage earning or whatever stage of our lives are sustaining ourselves has disappeared. And I would suggest that part of what you look at in terms of looking for a cure is not, I think you need to tell people like us about this, and I think we need to turn out. But we're not going to solve this problem by ourselves. There are whole groups of our society missing here, including the landlords, who are part of the process that may, if unaddressed and unmodified, do the obvious, which would be to drive our country into a much less satisfactory place to live for everyone in the society. So
Okay.
I plead with you to keep up this good work in the analysis. I'm applauding the analysis, but I'm saying we have to have more than the analysis. We need an outreach that's more compelling across society than we have in calling a meeting like this. We need other things going on as well. That's all I have to say.
Okay. Well, I'll just end it with, if you haven't read the book, be sure to read the book, because it is truly a help. And certainly I presume they'll be around a bit if you want to come up and talk to the panelists before they head out. They've been here a long time already, and we certainly thank you for coming. We really appreciate it.